I discovered my husband's business trips were actually visits to his other family in another state. The coffee mug slipped from my hands when I saw the notification on his phone. We'd been married for 8 years, and I thought I knew everything about him. He was supposed to be in Chicago for another boring conference, but the GPS location showed him in some small town in Nevada I'd never heard of. My stomach dropped as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I'd always trusted him completely, maybe too completely. His monthly business trips had become so routine that I barely questioned them anymore. He'd leave on Thursday morning with his navy blue suitcase and return Sunday evening, always exhausted but satisfied with his work. I'd stopped asking for details about his conferences years ago because his explanations were always so dry and technical. But something had been nagging at me for weeks. Small things that didn't quite add up. The way he'd gotten defensive when I suggested joining him on one of his trips. How he'd started keeping his phone face down during dinner. The expensive cologne I'd never seen him wear before his last departure. And most unsettling of all, the way he'd been extra affectionate before leaving, like he was overcompensating for something. That Thursday morning felt different from the moment he kissed me goodbye. He lingered at the door longer than usual, his hand resting on my cheek as he looked into my eyes with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something almost apologetic about it, like he was trying to tell me something without words. I brushed off the feeling and went about my day, but it stuck with me like a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. The phone notification came while I was doing dishes. He'd left his old work phone on the kitchen counter, probably by accident. I wasn't snooping, at least not intentionally. The screen lit up with a message from some app I didn't recognize, and that's when I saw the location pin. Nevada. Miles and miles away from where he was supposed to be. My hands were shaking as I set down the broken pieces of the mug. I tried to rationalize it, to find innocent explanations. Maybe the GPS was wrong. Maybe he'd made a last-minute change to his itinerary. Maybe there was a conference in Nevada he'd forgotten to mention. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, unable to concentrate on anything. Every possible scenario ran through my mind, each one worse than the last. I called his regular phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted him asking how the conference was going, and he responded hours later with a generic message about networking and presentations. The casual lie felt like a knife twisting in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was living in someone else's life. The man I'd shared everything with for 8 years was lying to me, and I had no idea why. I'd supported him through career changes, family drama, and health scares. We'd built what I thought was an unshakable foundation of trust and communication. Now it felt like that foundation was crumbling beneath my feet. Friday morning brought no relief. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and spent the day researching the town where his phone had pinged. It was a small place, with a population of maybe 15,000 people. Nothing special about it, no major businesses or conference centers. Just a typical American small town with a main street, a few restaurants, and residential neighborhoods. I couldn't figure out what would draw him there. I found myself going through his things, looking for clues I'd missed. His dresser drawers revealed nothing unusual. His desk was its normal organized chaos of work papers and bills. But in the pocket of a jacket he'd worn recently, I found a receipt from a restaurant in that same Nevada town. The date was from his last trip, and it was for 2 meals. 2 meals? The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I sat on our bedroom floor, holding that receipt, and felt my world shift completely. He wasn't just lying about where he was going. He was spending time with someone else, sharing meals, probably sharing so much more. The man I'd been making dinner for, doing laundry for, sharing my bed with, was living a double life. I wanted to confront him immediately, to call and demand answers. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what I'd discover, or maybe it was the desperate hope that there was still an innocent explanation. I decided to wait until he came home, to give him a chance to tell me the truth himself. The weekend dragged by like torture. I went through the motions of normal life, but everything felt hollow and fake. I cleaned the house obsessively, baked bread I didn't want to eat, and binged television shows I couldn't focus on. My sister called to check in, and I almost told her everything. But I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud, to make it real. Sunday evening came, and with it, the familiar sound of his key in the lock. He walked in looking tired as always, carrying his navy blue suitcase and a small bouquet of flowers. The flowers were new, another addition to his routine that now felt manipulative rather than sweet. He kissed my forehead and asked about my weekend, playing the part of the devoted husband returning from business. I watched him closely as he unpacked, looking for signs of deception. He seemed normal, maybe even more relaxed than usual. We had dinner together, and he told me about his conference presentations and networking sessions. The lies came so easily to him, so naturally, that I wondered how long he'd been living this double life. How many other trips had been fabrications? That night, as he slept peacefully beside me, I made a decision. I couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I started planning my own trip to Nevada, telling myself I was just going to drive by and see what I could learn. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I knew I couldn't move forward without answers. The next morning, after he left for his regular job, I called my boss and requested emergency family leave. I'd never used that benefit before, and the concern in her voice made me feel guilty for lying. But I was drowning in lies already, and one more seemed insignificant compared to the deception I was living with. I threw some clothes in a bag and started driving toward Nevada. The 8-hour trip gave me plenty of time to think, to rehearse what I might say or do when I got there. I imagined confronting him, demanding explanations, maybe even meeting whoever he was seeing. But as the miles passed, I realized I had no real plan. I was just running toward pain, unable to stop myself. The town looked exactly like I'd expected from my online research. Small, quiet, the kind of place where everyone probably knew each other's business. I checked into a motel on the outskirts and spent the evening driving around, getting familiar with the layout. I found the restaurant where he'd had that meal for two, a cozy family place that made my heart ache with its obvious romanticism. I was sitting in my rental car, outside a grocery store the next morning when I saw him. He was walking hand in hand with a woman I'd never seen before, laughing at something she'd said. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the woman. It was the 2 children with them, a boy and a girl who looked to be maybe 6 and 8 years old. They were calling him Daddy. Everything clicked into place with devastating clarity. The monthly trips, the defensive behavior, the extra affection before leaving. He wasn't having an affair. He was living a completely separate life, with a whole other family. Those children had his eyes, his smile, his way of gesturing when he was excited. This wasn't a recent development. This had been going on for years. I sat in that parking lot for what felt like hours, watching them load groceries into a car I'd never seen before. They looked like a perfect family, comfortable and natural together. The woman was beautiful in a way that made me feel invisible, and the children were clearly devoted to him. I was watching my husband be a father to kids I didn't even know existed. The rage came first, hot and consuming. I wanted to march over there and destroy their perfect moment, to expose him for the liar he was. But then came the crushing sadness, the realization that I'd been living a lie for who knows how long. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my future, was built on deception. I followed them home, keeping my distance. They lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where kids rode bikes in the street and neighbors waved to each other. I watched him help the children out of the car, saw him kiss the woman goodbye before she left for what I assumed was work. Then I watched him settle into domestic life with these kids, helping them with what looked like homework at the kitchen table. The scene was so normal, so loving, that it broke something inside me. This wasn't a man sneaking around having an affair. This was a man living 2 complete lives, being a husband and father in 2 different states. I thought about all the times I'd asked him about having children, how he'd always said he wasn't ready, that we needed to wait until his career was more stable. Meanwhile, he was already raising kids with someone else. I drove back to my motel in a daze, my mind spinning with questions. How long had this been going on? Had he been married to both of us? Were those children born before or after our wedding? How had he managed to keep such a massive secret? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do now? That night, I called my sister. I told her everything, from the GPS notification to what I'd witnessed in that parking lot. She listened without judgment, occasionally gasping at the more shocking revelations. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before asking the question I'd been dreading. Did I want to confront him, or did I want to just leave? I'd been so focused on uncovering the truth that I hadn't thought about what came next. Confrontation felt both necessary and terrifying. How do you accuse someone of living a double life? How do you process the fact that your entire marriage has been built on lies? But the alternative, just disappearing without explanation, felt like letting him win. I decided to stay another day, to gather more information before making any decisions. I drove past the house several times, noting details about their life together. There was a swing set in the backyard, children's bikes on the porch, a garden that looked well tended. This wasn't a casual relationship. This was a home, a life, a family. On Thursday morning, I saw him leave for what I assumed was his return trip to me. He hugged the children goodbye, kissed the woman with obvious affection, and drove away in a car I'd never seen before. I waited until he was out of sight, then approached the house. I don't know what I was planning to do, but I needed to see this woman, to understand how she fit into this impossible situation. She answered the door with a friendly smile that faltered when she saw my face. I must have looked as devastated as I felt, because her expression immediately shifted to concern. I introduced myself using my maiden name and asked if we could talk. Something in my tone must have alarmed her, because she stepped outside and closed the door behind her. I told her I needed to discuss her husband, and her face went pale. She said his name, the same name I'd been saying for 8 years, and I knew we were talking about the same man. When I told her I was his wife, she actually stumbled backward, gripping the porch railing for support. She said that was impossible, that she was his wife, and showed me her wedding ring. The conversation that followed was surreal. We compared notes, trying to piece together the timeline of his deception. She'd been married to him for 10 years, 2 years longer than I had. Their children were 7 and 9, which meant they'd been born during our marriage. She knew nothing about me, just as I'd known nothing about her. He'd told her he traveled for work, spending long weekends away for conferences and training sessions. We sat on her porch steps, two women who'd been unknowingly sharing a husband, trying to make sense of an impossible situation. She showed me family photos, wedding pictures, vacation snapshots. In every image, he looked genuinely happy, genuinely committed. It was like looking at parallel versions of my own life, except hers had children and mine didn't. The most shocking revelation came when she showed me their marriage certificate. The date was 3 months before our wedding. I'd been the other woman without knowing it, participating in what I'd thought was a legitimate marriage, but was actually an elaborate deception. She was his real wife, in every legal sense. I was just the woman he'd been lying to for 8 years. I felt sick, physically and emotionally. Everything I'd believed about my life was crumbling. I wasn't just betrayed, I was completely displaced. The children I'd dreamed of having with him already existed, just not with me. The family life I'd been building toward was already established, just not with me. I was the extra, the addition, the complication he'd been managing for years. She was surprisingly kind, considering I'd just turned her world upside down. She made coffee while we talked, and I found myself liking her despite the circumstances. She was smart, funny, and clearly devoted to her children. Under different circumstances, we might have been friends. Instead, we were victims of the same elaborate lie. We spent hours comparing details, finding the gaps in his stories and the ways he'd managed to keep us separate. He'd been incredibly careful, never posting family photos on social media, always paying for things in cash when he was with either of us. He'd even had separate phone numbers and email addresses. The level of organization required for such deception was almost impressive in its thoroughness. As the afternoon wore on, we started discussing what to do next. She was devastated but also angry, especially about the impact on her children. They adored him, and learning that their father was living a double life would destroy them. I felt guilty for being the catalyst that would tear their family apart, even though I'd been just as deceived as they were. We decided to confront him together when he returned on Sunday. She would tell him she knew about me, and I would be there to witness his reaction. It felt like the only way to get the truth, to force him to face the full scope of his deception. We exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet at her house that weekend. The drive home was a blur of emotion. I felt empty, hollowed out by the magnitude of what I discovered. My marriage wasn't just damaged, it was fraudulent. My husband wasn't just unfaithful, he was a stranger. The life I'd been living was built on lies so elaborate that I couldn't even begin to process them all. When I got home, I walked through our house like a tourist, seeing everything with new eyes. The photos on the walls showed a happy couple, but now I knew I was looking at a performance. The furniture we'd chosen together, the vacations we'd taken, the dreams we'd shared, all of it felt contaminated by his deception. I was living in a museum of lies. Friday and Saturday passed in a haze of numbness. I went through the motions of normal life, but everything felt distant and unreal. I kept thinking about those children, about how their lives were about to be shattered by their father's choices. I thought about the woman, about how she'd welcomed me into her crisis with more grace than I probably deserved. Sunday morning came too soon. I drove back to Nevada, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, but I knew that when the moment came, nothing would feel adequate. How do you confront someone about a deception so complete that it rewrites your entire shared history? She met me at the door, looking as nervous as I felt. Her children were at her mother's house, spared from witnessing what was about to happen. We sat in her living room, surrounded by evidence of the life she'd built with him, and waited for him to arrive. When we heard his car in the driveway, we both froze. He walked in carrying flowers again, already reaching for her with the same affectionate gesture I'd seen him use with me thousands of times. But when he saw me sitting on his other couch, in his other living room with his other wife, the flowers fell from his hands. His face went white, then red, then white again. For the first time in 8 years, I saw him completely at a loss for words. What followed was hours of painful conversation. He tried to explain, to justify, to minimize what he'd done. He claimed he'd gotten trapped in the situation, that he'd never meant for it to go on so long. He said he'd been planning to tell us both, that he'd been looking for the right time. Every word felt like another lie, another manipulation. The most heartbreaking moment came when he tried to claim that he loved us both equally, that he'd never been able to choose between us. He painted himself as the victim of his own emotions, as if his inability to make a decision justified years of deception. I looked at this man I'd shared my life with and realized I'd never really known him at all. She threw him out that afternoon, telling him never to contact their children again until he'd figured out how to tell them the truth. I watched him load his possessions into his car, the same navy blue suitcase he'd carried back and forth between his two lives. He looked at me with what might have been remorse, but I felt nothing but emptiness. I drove home alone, leaving behind the wreckage of 2 families. The woman and I had exchanged information, promising to help each other through the legal and emotional aftermath. We were bonded now by shared trauma, 2 strangers who discovered we'd been living parallel lives without knowing it. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and devastating realizations. Our marriage had never been legal, which simplified some things but complicated others. I had no claim to the house, the cars, or any of the assets we'd accumulated together. Legally, I'd been his girlfriend for 8 years, not his wife. The life I'd built was not just emotionally fraudulent, but legally meaningless. The hardest part was telling people. Family, friends, coworkers, all of them struggled to understand how such elaborate deception was possible. Some were sympathetic, others seemed to blame me for not seeing the signs. I blamed myself too, wondering how I could have been so blind, so trusting, so naive. I moved in with my sister temporarily, sleeping on her couch and trying to rebuild my sense of self. Everything I defined myself by, wife, partner, future mother, had been stripped away. I was starting over at 32, with no clear idea of who I was outside of the lies I'd been living. The woman from Nevada called regularly, updating me on her situation and offering support. She was filing for divorce, arranging custody, dealing with her children's confusion and anger. They'd been told their father had to move away for work, a gentler version of the truth that protected them from the worst of it. She was stronger than I was, more focused on moving forward than dwelling on the past. Months passed before I started to feel like myself again. I found a small apartment, started seeing a counselor, and began the slow process of rebuilding my life. I learned to enjoy my own company, to make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what we wanted. I discovered interests I'd forgotten I had, dreams I'd put aside for a future that had never been real. The divorce proceedings were complicated by the fact that we'd never actually been married. He tried to claim that meant he owed me nothing, but my lawyer argued that I'd been deceived into believing in a legal partnership. We eventually reached a settlement that gave me some financial security while I rebuilt my life. I never saw him again after that Sunday afternoon, but I heard updates through mutual friends. He'd moved to a different state, started over somewhere new. I wondered if he'd learned from his mistakes, or if he was already working on creating a new set of lies. Some people never change, and I'd learned that he was one of them. The woman from Nevada and I stayed in touch, bonding over our shared experience in a way that felt both healing and strange. We'd become friends through the worst betrayal either of us had experienced, and that friendship became one of the few positive things to come from the whole mess. She was rebuilding her life too, focusing on her children and her own healing. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed, the red flags I ignored. But I also understand that some deceptions are so complete, so carefully constructed, that they're almost impossible to detect. He'd been living a double life for years before I even met him, perfecting his technique, learning how to manage the logistics of loving two families simultaneously. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the lies people tell themselves and others. But I'm also more appreciative of genuine connection, of relationships built on truth rather than deception. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient than I'd ever been tested to be. Today, I'm building a life that's completely my own. I have a job I love, friends who know my whole story, and a future that's mine to define. I'm not the same person I was when I first saw that GPS notification, and I'm grateful for that. The woman who believed every lie, who trusted without question, who built her identity around someone else's deception, she's gone. In her place is someone who knows her own worth, who won't settle for anything less than complete honesty. Sometimes I wonder about those children, about how they're processing their father's abandonment. I hope they're healing, that they're learning to trust again despite what he did to their family. I hope their mother continues to find strength in her new independence, that she's building something beautiful from the ashes of what he destroyed. As for him, I try not to think about him at all. He's a chapter in my life that's closed, a lesson learned, a mistake I'll never make again. The 8 years I spent with him weren't entirely wasted. They taught me what I don't want, what I won't accept, what I deserve. And sometimes, that's the most valuable lesson of all.